The good news is we've seen some improvement. The bottom line is it's still not an acceptable level of delays and cancellations. Weather issues happen, but they cascade through the system because the system is not yet able to cope.
Hello and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm David J. Lynch, Global Economics Correspondent here at the Post. Today we have two segments on the airline industry and the future of aviation. Later on, we'll be joined by United Airlines CEO Scott Kirby. But first, we're going to hear from Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg. Mr. Secretary, welcome back to Washington Post Live.
Nice to be with you again. Thanks for having me.
Well, we're delighted you're here. I want to start by asking a question about the often miserable experience of traveling by air in this country. Particularly this summer, air passengers put up with an enormous number of flight delays and cancellations. Airline schedules seem to be really just suggestions about what might happen rather than any sort of commitment for a plane to take off, fly somewhere, and land. Can you walk us through the factors that explain this? What happened?
So, in a nutshell, what happened was demand came back more quickly than the airline sector was ready to support. On one hand, great news that passengers have the income and the inclination to return to the skies just a year or two after we were wondering whether the U.S. airline sector was going to survive at all. But the problem has been that there has not been enough by way of staffing, resources, and a number of other issues have presented themselves as part of these shockwaves that have come since the pandemic first arrived that left the sector unable to handle this increase in demand. And we saw that reflected in the number of cancellations and delays we experienced over the summer. So there's always going to be some level of travel disruption. Weather alone is a big part of that. And it's not unusual to have 1% or 2% of flights canceled, especially during the summer. What we saw this summer was several busy travel weekends where it was more like 4%. Now, I know the difference between 2% and 4% doesn't sound like much mathematically, but it makes all the difference in the world in terms of whether the system is able to catch up, keep up. And it's really the difference between things feeling pretty much like business as usual and seeing headlines that use words like chaos and meltdown. So early in the summer, I got together, asked all of the airline leadership to come together and lay out what could be done differently and how my department could help in terms of making sure that things moved on to a smoother footing. We've seen a lot of improvements since then, but as we look back on the summer, it's clear that the system is still not as resilient as it needs to be for us to be confident that the passengers will be free from these kinds of increased cancellations and delays that affected so many of us over the course of this year.
Fair enough. The pandemic obviously was very disruptive. The recovery from this historic episode has been perhaps understandably uneven. At the same time, taxpayers did pony up $54 billion to support the airlines and presumably prepare them for the resumption of travel. Did we get our money's worth?
Well, I certainly think it was the right move to step in and ensure that the airline industry did not collapse in 2020, 2021. One of the best moments of the early days that I had in this job was when I got word from the flight attendants union that they in turn had got word to tear up their furlough notices because the American Rescue Plan had passed. There was a very real danger of things actually falling apart in a way that would have been irreversible. But the other side of that is when tens of billions of dollars of taxpayer money went into supporting this industry, it is very surprising, puzzling, and frustrating to get to where, as we all hoped would happen, demand is back, passengers are back, airlines are back, and by the way, back into what looks like very profitable territory as we get into the reporting that's coming out in this part of this year. And you're still seeing these kinds of services. And I'll give you an example of one of the things that I think contributed to that. These dollars, these taxpayer dollars that went to rescue the airlines, they did have strings attached. If you took that taxpayer money, you couldn't turn around and fire people left and right. But there were still a lot of early retirement where people, including pilots, who were very hard to replace. It takes a long time to train a pilot. They were nudged into early retirement, or at least encouraged to do that, in a way that left the airlines without some of the resilience and readiness they needed to service these routes when the passengers did come back by. So that's a big part of what the airlines need to work on right now, is making sure they have staffing levels that are adequate. And by the way, this is something that's happened across the system, even within the department and the FAA. We're working still to recover from the hole that COVID blew in the training and qualification of air traffic control, so that we can make sure that that's never a constraint on operations.
So just to be clear, do you think the airlines mismanaged their staffing requirements?
Well, certainly they need to be prepared to service the tickets that they sell, and we didn't see that going into this summer. Part of that had to do with staff levels. I think also part of that had to do with scheduling. A lot of schedules that just weren't realistic. And so one of the things that I urged the airlines to do, and to their credit, I think took place over the summer, was a trimming of the schedules, a thinning out of the schedules to make sure that they were more realistic and more in alignment with what they could actually support, given a realistic look at the staff levels that they have.
Now, our next guest, United Airlines CEO Scott Kirby, has blamed the Federal Aviation Administration for many of the delays. How much of the situation legitimately is the responsibility of the federal government?
Well, certainly not most of it. And if you look at the statistics around the causes of delays and cancellations, I want to be very clear that the majority of them are not the result of air traffic control staffing or related issues. But it is true that we have had constraints on the air traffic control side, again, largely because there was a disruption to the pipeline of getting controllers prepared. That was especially causing issues in the New York area and in the Florida area. Again, I want to be clear, in our aviation system, not responsible for the majority of the delays, but to the extent that that has been an issue, we have leaned into working on solutions and make sure that we have regular operational communication all the way down to the day-to-day level with the airlines to make sure that we're aligning our resources the best we can to meet demand and that we're in touch with them. Something's happened that I don't think anybody expected, including demand, for example, in that Florida market, actually returning to levels that are higher than they were before the pandemic. And Florida, unfortunately, experienced a perfect storm of issues that included everything from weather to space launches, military activity, air traffic control issues, and some of these staffing concerns that have plagued the airline. So anytime there's anything that we can do to be part of the solution, we're going to move very quickly to do that. But none of that, of course, absolves the airlines of the responsibility as they sell profitable tickets to be ready to provide an adequate level of customer service to back those up.
Now, anecdotally, the situation does seem to have improved since the summer, or at least become less awful than it was at that point. What's your assessment of the current state of play? How satisfactory or not is it? And to the extent that we have seen some progress, how confident are you that it will stand up to increased demand over the holiday season?
So the good news is we are seeing several steps really bear fruit in terms of things we've been working on and things that the airlines have done. And some of that has taken a lot of pushing on our side. We're really doing three things at once in order to drive an improved passenger experience. The first is enforcing the rules we have, especially when we have issues like airlines failing to issue the refunds that passengers are entitled to if they get a delay, a major delay, or a cancellation, and clarifying the rules around that. The second is raising the floor. In other words, improving the rules as they stand and making sure that they're tough enough. And the third is using tools for things like transparency. So one thing that I think led to a lot of improvement was actually very simple, especially compared to the complexity of a federal regulation or rulemaking, which was earlier this summer. We put together a website listing the top 10 airlines and just giving you a green check mark or a red X next to basic customer service practices that they were committed in writing to do. Things like, do they promise in writing that they're going to give you a meal or a hotel voucher if you get stuck and it's their fault? Or will they rebook you on another airline? And when we made that decision to put up that website, which only took a week or two to build, I notified the airlines that it was coming and encouraged them to use those next few days to raise their customer service standards. In that 2-week period, we went from 0 to, I think, 9 out of the top 10 airlines committing that they would at least do hotels and meals, and went from, I think, 1 to 10 out of the top 10 airlines. Indicating that they were committed to rebooking you if you got stuck. So those are some of the improvements that we've seen, and we'll continue driving more. But on the operational side, we're not out of the woods yet. There is more work to do on the airlines when it comes to staffing. For us, when it comes to getting our air traffic control where we want and need it to be. And I think for the system and the economy as a whole. So we're cautiously watching this holiday period. I think it'll be an improvement from the toughest moments we saw over the summer, but not perfect. As we go into next year and start to see some of these pandemic shock waves fully work their way through the system.
I don't want to minimize the progress that's been made, but I have to say, when I looked at that online dashboard, I was struck by how fairly modest the compensations are that are provided by airlines. A commitment to rebook you on a flight on the same airline and take you where you've already paid to go, maybe a voucher for a meal or a hotel. That's obviously better than the alternative. Except when you fly in Europe, the compensation when the airlines don't deliver what they've promised is typically hundreds of dollars paid back to you in compensation. Why am I so better protected when I travel in the EU than I am here at home?
Well, there's no easy apples to apples comparison between US and European regulations, but it is worth noting that there are additional consumer protections that other countries have, and we're taking a look at that right now. As a matter of fact, we have 2 pending regulations out for comment right now, which means that if you're a passenger and you want to weigh in, you can go to our website and share your experiences or make your views known. One of them has to do with ancillary fees and making sure there's accountability when you don't get what you paid for when you pay for fees like baggage or Wi-Fi. And a second having to do with cancellations and delays and toughening the rules around that. And we may well have reason to go further in that direction. So what we're trying to do is make sure that we enforce an adequate floor, but also encourage the airlines to go well above and beyond that floor, which is part of why we found transparency has been as powerful a tool as the regulatory side. And we're going to continue to use both.
Now, as you know, in August, a bipartisan group of state attorneys general complained that your agency was, quote, unable or unwilling to hold the airline industry accountable, close quote, and asked for states to be given new powers in this area to step in, and for the Federal Trade Commission to take over from DOT in some areas. What's your response to those complaints? And in hindsight, are there things that you think your department could have done or should have done during the worst of this situation?
Well, I'm proud of the results that we were able to get, including some actions that we had undertaken before this summer of travel problems even took place. It was before the summer, for example, that we issued the strongest fine in the history of the Consumer Protection Program against an airline that was failing to meet its obligations in terms of refunds. And we're going to keep pushing and keep working to get more results. We are also working with states, working with attorneys general to make sure that that their view and their authorities are represented. We have an attorney general, for example, the Attorney General of Michigan, participating in our Aviation Consumer Protection Advisory Committee, which is helping to frame some of the road ahead for the work that we do. I don't think it's workable to have 50 or 52 different regulatory frameworks for a single national aviation system, which is why we need a strong federal role here. But we do recognize the consumer protection experience that a lot of attorneys general have, and welcome the chance to work with them on some of these opportunities.
But are there any specific areas or reforms that you'd be willing to put forward, perhaps working with Congress to sort of toughen up the pressure on airlines to do a better job of providing the service that they're selling? As you indicated earlier, in many cases, the airline schedules were way beyond what they knew they had the people to deliver, and yet they don't seem to have paid much of a price for that.
Well, this is one of the reasons why making sure passengers get the refunds they're entitled to is so important, right? In theory, if everybody gets those refunds when their flight is canceled, that means that there would never be any incentive for an airline to do unrealistic scheduling. They would only be hurting their own profitability when they did it. That's in theory. We need to make sure practice catches up to theory. And that's part of what we've been working on, again, in 3 parallel lines of effort. Enforcement of the rules that we have, toughening of the rules so that they're stronger than they were, and transparency around airline practices, which we found can be actually a very fast-acting ingredient toward an improved passenger experience. Definitely interested in continuing to work with Congress as well on possibilities on what we can do. For example, we have a remarkably hardworking consumer protection team, but I think far, far fewer people than most Americans would expect in this department, who handle everything from drafting regulations to handling the tens of thousands of complaints that come in. And by the way, you should know that as a passenger, that if you're not being treated appropriately by an airline, you can let us know directly, and we can follow up and enforce on that. But working with Congress to make sure that our aviation consumer protection team has the resources and the technology and the staffing that they need to be proactive and not just reactive, which they've done with remarkably lean resources to date. That's just one example of something that I really welcome a chance to work with Congress on furthering and strengthening.
Now, later this week, shareholders of Spirit Airlines are scheduled to vote on the proposed merger with JetBlue. And I realize antitrust questions are not your bailiwick. They belong to the Attorney General. Benefit consumers, whether there's sufficient competition in the industry in general, or whether this consolidation trend is a problem.
Well, as you mentioned, DOJ has the lead on this, although I should note that we also have some responsibilities when it comes to not just consumer protection, but the competition side of how airlines are managed in this country, and it's something that we're leaning into pursuant to the President's executive order around competition. I'm not going to weigh in directly on something that is being adjudicated right now and that DOJ is working on, but I will say broadly that we need to make sure there is a very rigorous standard for how we evaluate all of this, because if you go back to the history of airline deregulation, you look at what was expected in the 1970s when we really changed the way that the aviation sector works in our economy. Most people who were advancing deregulation sincerely believed that there would be dozens of competitive airlines competing for market share in the U.S. economy by the time we got into the 2000s. And in fact, what we've seen across the 2000s is fewer and fewer airlines, where now just a handful control more than 2/3 of the market. Anytime you have that kind of concentration, you have to be especially vigilant about any indications that that is either depressing the passenger experience or creating upward pressure on prices. And I know that's something that within the authorities we have, my department continues to look at, and I trust it's a big part of how DOJ is evaluating things too.
I want to take a moment to ask you about a different mode of travel now, rail, and under the heading of infrastructure projects, which I know is a big focus of yours. It's clear our infrastructure across the board needs an upgrade. It's not clear that we've necessarily figured out how to build these big projects on time and at a reasonable cost. And much as I hate to advertise our competition, the New York Times had a very good story the other day about the high-speed rail project in California, which has spent billions of dollars and doesn't have much to show for it to this point. And things were so bad that a French company that was actually involved in that project gave up and went to Morocco instead, because they said there was less political dysfunction in North Africa than there was in the great state of California. So as we prepare to build out major projects under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, how confident are you that we're not going to see these kind of mishaps, these kind of problems crop up time and time again?
Well, this is one reason why we're very focused on delivery. Matter of fact, we just had a summit at the White House on exactly this topic last week, and it's a major focus in my department and all of the other departments working on delivering the President's infrastructure law. And look, we're up against a real headwind that's not just a function of the politics and economics of American infrastructure today. It's a function of mega projects in general. You could go all the way back to antiquity and the construction of temples and pyramids to see all the many, many ways in which very big projects very frequently take longer and cost more than they were supposed to or were expected to. And so much depends on us fighting off that tendency because we need to make sure that the American people see $1.2 trillion worth of value out of the $1.2 trillion in funding that the president has signed, about half of which is for transportation infrastructure as part of this infrastructure package. It's one of the reasons why we're engaging very closely with the project sponsors who are doing the building. Notably, that's typically not our department. It's usually a state, a transit agency, a city, an airport that's specifically undertaking the project. We need to connect them up with the resources they need, not just in terms of the project funding itself, but in terms of best practices, technical assistance, attention to the permitting process and community engagement so that it happens early, often, and serves to smooth out the project instead of leading to 11th hour delays, which is largely a matter of getting that kind of engagement right and looking at other things that can be done to create an alternative to the complexity of a lot of this. Even in our own department, just things like the process of grant making. We started consolidating multiple programs from multiple applications into one so that there's less paperwork. This is something we're going to have to continue to be very vigilant on, especially in an inflationary environment where time is money, and the sooner you can get a project done, the more affordable it's going to be for taxpayers. And that's true, not to leave aviation, just to give one set of examples. You look at the investments we're making in LAX to improve the dreaded horseshoe where it can take half an hour just to drop somebody off, the way the highway and the road meets the drop-off area. Denver, where we're investing in better baggage claim system because we know that's going to help speed processing there. Atlanta, where Concourse D needs to be about 20 feet wider than it currently is, and we're providing funding as part of the vision of making that a reality. Airports large and small, all the way down to Chamberlain, South Dakota, where the general aviation terminal right now is a mobile home, and we have a grant of about $800,000 that's going to help them have a consistent, permanent building there that meets the needs of that rural community. Even within the aviation sector, we see so many projects where success is so important to the communities they serve, and delivery is so important to whether those projects are the success that we all envision them to be.
Now, in the 60 seconds or so that we have left, I know you've worked a lot on the supply chain situation in the country that's been a big contributor to our inflation problem. How do you assess the progress at this point? I know the queue of ships waiting off the coast of Southern California is way down from its record high, still a little higher than its pre-pandemic level. How much progress do you think has been made? How much of it is due to the federal government's efforts? How much is just a reflection of slower production coming out of China and perhaps weaker demand as higher interest rates bite here?
So we've definitely seen a lot of progress. This time last year, we were looking at something like 100 ships bearing down on the West Coast ports. Last time I checked, it was more on the order of a dozen or sometimes even in single digits. But that doesn't mean that the issues are solved. I'm proud of the work that we've done, especially with our supply chains task force, working every end of the supply chain from ship to shore, from the container terminals to the availability of chassis to the support for the trucking workforce, all the way through to the warehouse, the rail system, which is key, and ultimately to the shelf and to your home. So we are going to be in a dramatically better position this retail season than we were last year. Although I would note that last year, after all the pain and frustration we went through in months like October, we got through the holiday season with an all-time record high in terms of retail sales. And that's really because so many people, beginning with the port workers and truck drivers and warehouse and rail and other workers, stepped up to deliver. We are not out of the woods on these supply chain disruptions. Let me be very clear about that. More work to be done in the immediate term, which we're undertaken, and in the long term, which is why we're making these big infrastructure investments in every part of our multimodal transportation systems. But we are in decidedly better shape than we were, and looking forward to more progress in the months ahead.
Great, interesting. And unfortunately, we are now out of time, so we'll have to leave it there. Secretary Pete Buttigieg, thanks so much for joining us today.
Pleasure to be with you. Thanks.
Now, up next, we'll be joined by United Airlines CEO Scott Kirby right after this video, so please stand by.
This is GE Aerospace, advancing flight for future generations. Welcome to a new era of flight.
Hello, I'm Jean Meserve. It has been a challenging few years for the aviation industry. First the pandemic, then the recovery from the pandemic, and then some new shock waves, including labor shortages, high energy prices, and the Russia-Ukraine war. With me to discuss is Larry Culp. He is chairman and CEO of GE and also CEO of GE Aerospace. Great to have you with us today.
Thank you, Jean.
So first, of those challenges that I mentioned, which do you see as the most consequential and how are you dealing with it?
Jean, I would say it's probably the convergence of all of those challenges that have come together here the last couple of years to make this perhaps the most daunting operating environment I've seen in my career. We power at GE Aerospace 3 out of every 4 commercial departures around the world on a daily basis. So we're working very hard with our customers to return to flight. And at the same time, our airframer customers are ramping production at a rather dramatic rate, and we're working to keep pace with them as well. We're doing all of that very much using the lean management principles that we've used here over the last several years, which help us enhance the safety and quality of what we do for our customers, all the while improving our delivery and productivity performance. This is an exciting time, we believe, in the aerospace industry. We're pleased to play the role that we do, and we look forward over the next several years to be part of that recovery.
You mentioned lean management, you embraced it, you used it to drive GE's turnaround. For those who aren't familiar with the term, what is lean management and how are you using it exactly in the current circumstances?
Gene, lean management, as it's known today, is really rooted in the Toyota production system, which came about after World War II as Toyota was trying to manage through a period of great scarcity. Today, it's a wonderful way to run a factory, but also really, I think, the best way to run a business. There are a lot of elements to lean, but some of the core principles are a focus on the customer, relying on the people who are closest to the work to improve it, making every day count through daily management, and solving problems at their root cause. Now, a lot of that is common sense, and I've often used the shorthand of common sense vigorously applied to define lean, but it really does shape the way we do the work that we do with our airframer customers, the airlines, and our suppliers to improve safety, quality, delivery, and cost on a regular basis. And it's really helping us today, not only in our engine manufacturing operations, improve our output quarter in, quarter out, but also in our service operations to reduce the turnaround time required for us to repair or overhaul an engine to get it back up in the air.
Let's talk for a moment about sustainability. You took part in the first ever experimental flight with passengers that used 100% sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF. How critical is SAF to reaching the goal of net zero flights by 2050?
Gene, I think most of us in the industry see SAF as playing a critical role as we move forward toward those net zero goals. We were thrilled to have the opportunity to partner with United Airlines on that first flight, 100% SAF in one engine. Scott Kirby, their CEO, has really spearheaded their efforts, and I think very much for the industry as well with respect to sustainability. But it's not going to be just SAF alone in our view. We're working with Airbus, for example, on a hydrogen propulsion demonstrator. We're doing the same thing with NASA in and around hybrid electrics with an eye toward powering a commercial airliner this decade. And we're also updating and advancing traditional propulsion systems. Our RISE program aims to utilize open fan architectures to drive in excess of a 20% improvement in efficiency and in turn emissions. So there's a lot to do on the path to 2050.
Some of that is down the road. What are you doing right now to address sustainability?
Gene, we think we're doing a lot today because if you look at what GE Aerospace has done through the last several decades, it's with each generation of technology, improve efficiency and reduce emissions. If you look at today's engines compared to those that we produced in the 1980s, our engines are 40% more efficient today, largely through advanced design capabilities and manufacturing techniques like 3D printing and CMCs. That gives us tremendous capability not only today, but we couple that with our foam wash service capabilities in addition to using software from our GE Digital Aviation business to help airlines plan and operate routes in a more efficient and productive way.
Is sustainability also a concern of your military customers?
Gene, very much so. And we see tremendous read across from our commercial business to our military business, and at times in the other direction as well. We are working on a next generation engine, the XA100 for the F-35, and improved efficiency and emissions is very much a part of what the military is driving with that program. Interestingly, this next generation technology, which we think should drive a 20% improvement in capability, also enhances that platform's mission capability, particularly as it pertains to range. So all of those objectives are ones that we hope will be able to deliver for our military customers.
Larry Culp, Chairman and CEO of GE and also CEO of GE Aerospace, thanks so much for joining us. And now back to the Washington Post.
Welcome back. And for those of you just tuning in, welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm David J. Lynch, Global Economics Correspondent here at the Post. I'm joined now by United Airlines CEO Scott Kirby to continue our discussion about the future of aviation. Scott, welcome to Washington Post Live.
Thanks for having me, David.
Well, we're glad you're here. I want to start you off with the same question I asked Secretary Buttigieg, which is basically what happened to air travel this summer. I think the traveling public, many of us still bear the scars from the flight delays, the cancellations that we saw, not just United, but all across the industry. What explains the disappointing performance?
Well, David, I think if you bear scars, you must have been flying an airline other than United, because the reality is that at United, we actually had the best third quarter operating performance in the history of United Airlines, excluding 2020 when we weren't flying. But we had the best on-time performance, lowest cancellation rate. So I think this narrative, it's true at some airlines, but at United, despite all the challenges around the industry and around the globe, it turns out that we actually had the best operating performance that we've had since 2020, and October is now setting even bigger and newer records. So I feel really good about where we are at United and where we're headed for the future for our customers.
Well, I must have been unlucky enough to catch you on a bad day at the end of July, but I won't belabor the point. I am curious though about the planning assumptions that you took into the year in terms of what you anticipated by way of how the traveling recovery would manifest itself. What did you expect, and how different was the set of circumstances that ultimately played out?
Yeah, we expected strong demand. It's been even stronger than we started. And one of the things that we changed, and one of the reasons the summer was the best. That doesn't mean it was perfect. And particularly there, any days that there were weather delays, and we had some other unique challenges, which we may or may not talk about that really weren't United related directly, but is we pulled the schedule back, and we just decided we have 10% more pilots per block hour than we had pre-pandemic. We're running a lower utilization of our aircraft than we were before the pandemic, and all of that is to build more buffer into the system. One other big change that happened for United is we had 52 of our biggest airplanes, the Pratt & Whitney powered 777s, 52 of our largest airplanes that were grounded, that came online really at the beginning of the summer. And it takes time to ramp that up. And that has a huge impact that just flows through the whole system. And so while the third quarter was the best in our history, every single month in the quarter got meaningfully better. September was by a wide margin better. July wouldn't have been better. But that 777 issue was probably the biggest. But I think the most significant thing that we've done differently is build more buffer into the system. And look, there's issues beyond our control. I know that Secretary Buttigieg was on earlier. I talked to him, about air traffic control. That's one of the issues. But the issue there really is the FAA does an amazing job, and they jump through all kinds of hoops to keep the air traffic control system running. But we have fewer controllers today in the United States than we had 30 years ago. And we have about triple the number of operations. That means there's a system that is just on the very edge. And what's really happened with the FAA is they've been asked to do so much more. They're doing space launches and drones and far more certification work without an increase in their budget at the same time. And so those resources have come out of the day-to-day operation. And I think what we all need to do, is what I told the Secretary yesterday when we spoke, is work in the next FAA reauthorization bill to get the air traffic control system staffed. We've invested billions of dollars in the infrastructure around this country. We wind up with air traffic control delays for one or two sick calls that have impact of hundreds of flight delays or can have impacts of hundreds of delays or cancellations. And so those are the kinds of issues that I think still remain to be resolved. And we're all should work together to do that. And it's nobody's fault that we're here, but we are where we are, and we should work together to really get the FAA resourced appropriately. And to say that we have the same number of controllers or fewer controllers today than we did 30 years ago just doesn't pass the smell test for anyone, I don't think.
And so, looking ahead, what should people expect as they head out for the holiday season, November and December this year? How well do you think the system can stand up to the strain?
Yeah, look, the system is running really well right now. I've said we're setting records every day. In fact, our operating team said last week was the best week in all of our records at United Airlines operations. So we're running well. The truth is the whole industry is running a lot better. I think everyone has done to some, to greater or lesser degree what United has done, which is simply fly less, build more buffer into the system. And we've built that buffer into the system, and that's letting us overcome more of the challenges. I mean, look at the impact that the devastating impact that Hurricane Ian had on Florida and the Southeast. While it had devastating human and toll on buildings and infrastructure, airlines came back pretty quickly, and more so than they've ever done in the past. I think that's an indication that the industry is just building more buffer into the system, and that buffer is letting us recover quickly. And so I think, and I think also, by the way, I know the FAA is focused on the holidays, and they're pulling more levers, whether it's overtime or having people come in for extra shifts in order to cover for things, and they're focused on it. And so I'm hopeful that the holidays will go well. But it is a system that's tight, and in a system that's tight, if you get bad weather or get something that happens, it can be challenging. But it's a better setup than the whole industry had going into the summer.
Now, one thing I think we've seen during the recovery is that leisure travel has bounced back more quickly or more completely than has business travel. To what extent do you think that change in your customer mix is permanent, and to what extent is it just taking longer? Will business travel ever go back to where it was in 2019?
Well, I think this is one of the big takeaways. We just released earnings half an hour ago, and we're going to talk about it at our earnings call tomorrow. One of the epiphanies that I've had recently is there's a structural change in leisure, what we call leisure travel, that is higher. People are going to travel more. And the reason is because hybrid work now gives them the flexibility to travel when they didn't have it before. If you're working hybrid, it means every weekend has the potential to be a 3 or 4 day weekend. When you were tethered to your desk and had to be there Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, you couldn't get away for a weekend. Now you can leave on Wednesday or Thursday or come back on Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday and work remotely for 1 or 2 days. And what we saw in September, for example, September was the third highest RASM month in the history of United Airlines. And September is the most off-peak of all months. And for that to be the third highest in our history was remarkable. What we saw is the midweek days, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, had about an 8-point improvement in load factor, while the weekend days, they had an improvement, but they were up about 3%. That is all about people taking having the flexibility to travel now more than they did before. I think it's a permanent structural change in demand because people can now are untethered from their desks and have the flexibility and the freedom to travel for weekend getaways more than they ever did in the past.
Airlines, like many other industries, have struggled to find enough workers to do the work that needs to be done. I believe United became the first major U.S. airline earlier this year to open up a school, your own school, to train pilots. Tell me a little bit about what went into that decision and how well is it working?
Yeah. So first, it says we're on track to hire 15,000 new employees at United Airlines this year. We create great careers. They're not jobs, they're careers where people can, earn 6-digit incomes after they've been here a few years, great benefits. And because of that, we don't actually have a challenge hiring at United Airlines. A lot of the infrastructure around us does, whether it's, screeners or the FAA or fuel vendors and others. But we don't have a problem. But there is a shortage of pilots in the aviation industry. It has more pernicious effects in other places than just at United Airlines. And we decided during the pandemic to be the only airline that I know of in the world that founded our own flight training academy. It's called Aviate. We bring in students. They can come in with no training experience. We give them better training than they got traditionally in civilian flight schools, including things we call it upset recovery training. But we give them better training, more training than they would get somewhere else. They, of course, still have to pass all the certification that any pilot would have to pass to get through. But we're going to take about 500 people a year through the Aviate Training Academy and then have them in the United Airlines ecosystem with the ability to fly, someday fly a United wide-body jet. And not only are we doing a great job at training the next generation of pilots, but we're making a difference on diversity efforts with this. Today, fewer than 20% of the pilots in the United States are women or people of color. 80% of our students at the Aviate Academy are women or people of color. And if you go out there, it's one of the most inspirational things you can see to listen to their stories and talk and hear them talk about their excitement for their future and the opportunity that it creates for them. So we're really proud. It's the right thing to do for us as a business, but it's also the right thing for us to do just for society at large. And it's a perfect example of the difference that private companies can make that go beyond just doing day-to-day business decisions.
Earlier today, I believe you participated in the first Eco Skies Alliance Summit, along with Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo and several members of Congress. What's that alliance about, and what sort of concrete accomplishments do you anticipate from it?
Yeah. Well, United is the leader in global aviation in terms of sustainability by a wide margin. And the Eco Skies Alliance is about increasing the size of the tent and partners that will help us invest and more than anything, be a megaphone for the kinds of long-term investments that we need to make in order to get to 100% green. United is unique, not just amongst aviation, but unique amongst companies in making a commitment to be 100% green by 2050. And that is different than net zero, which is what most companies say. And the reason is we've committed to getting to 100% green without using traditional carbon offsets. And the reason for that is traditional carbon offsets are mostly about planting trees. And there's nothing wrong with planting trees. But the truth is, most of those carbon offsets aren't real. Those are trees that were going to be planted anyway, or trees that were never going to be cut down. But the bigger point is That system can't scale. If we planted every square inch of the planet that could grow trees, it would account for less than 5 months of mankind's emissions. By the way, we'd all starve to death because we just covered up all the farms. But it also, because it's only 5 months, it's done and it's over. And the real problem we have, I think, in corporate America, not just in aviation, with net zero commitments is because they rely on this really small thing, which is planting trees. It's the easy answer. And the easy answer isn't going to get us there. And we have to do something different. So for us at United, the two big ones are sustainable aviation fuel and carbon sequestration.
Right, and I think you've got an interim goal of cutting your greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2035. What makes that difficult? What are the hurdles that you've got to clear between now and then to make that a reality? And how widespread or how easily available is so-called sustainable aviation fuel?
Well, the answer to the first part of the question is wrapped up in the second part. The only way to get there is sustainable aviation fuel for United and for aviation around the world. And the problem is that industry is tiny today. United's commitment to sustainable aviation fuel is more than all the rest of the world's airlines combined, but it's still just a drop in the bucket of our total needs. And the challenge is we've got to build that industry. It basically doesn't exist today. The great news is the Inflation Reduction Act had several provisions about sustainability that I think we will look back 15 years from now and say it was one of the most consequential pieces of legislation passed in the last 30 years. And particularly what it does for SAF, for hydrogen credits, and for carbon sequestration is really it makes hundreds of projects potentially viable that weren't before. And the key is going to be once we start investing in those projects, we can drive the economies of scale and make the economics work on a long-term sustainable basis. It really is the seed capital to jumpstart these industries. And I believe we'll be able to do the same thing with SAF and with carbon sequestration that happened with wind and solar, which if you went back 20 or 30 years ago, people said were uneconomic, could never compete with coal or natural gas. And today it's cheaper to produce a megawatt of electricity from wind or solar than it is from coal or nat gas. And the same thing can happen with SAF and carbon sequestration. And the Inflation Reduction Act really enables hundreds of projects that weren't viable before. And I think that's going to be the key to getting to our goals.
And so how quickly can SAF be brought online in a meaningful sense? I mean, what sort of goals do you have to get to 20% of your fuel consumption, 50%, et cetera, et cetera? Lay out the timeline for me to the extent that
we're years away. We're years away. And the issue is really feedstock. And so that is, what do you use to make the fuel? Is it corn? Is it used cooking oil? And all of those are constrained. One of the challenges has been that if you're producing renewable diesel or ethanol, there were always government credits. And so you were always better off using that corn or whatever the feedstock was. You're better off using it to produce ethanol or diesel than you were SAF because you got extra government credits. The Inflation Reduction Act gets us onto a more level playing field. So we could use those. I think the biggest answer is power to liquid. The only way to really solve this liquid fuel issue, which is SAF and others, but liquid fuel issue is going to be power liquids. Power liquids is taking carbon from some source. It can be straight out of the atmosphere, combining it with water and using clean energy. So using wind or solar to use that energy to turn the carbon and the water into fuel. And that literally is, making fuel out of thin air. It takes energy, so you need clean energy to do it. But I think that's the most promising and scalable technology for the future. But it's just beginning, and it's years away from really being scalable. But it's okay. I mean, this is not going to be linear. If you look at the curves, for any technology like this, they're very slow and shallow at the bottom, and then they hit an inflection point and they go through the roof once you get the technology working. We're still in the get the technology working phase.
I want to go to a question from a member of our audience. Christopher Bolsinger from Massachusetts asks, is decreasing greenhouse gas emissions enough? What disruptive technologies are we exploring to rethink air travel more broadly?
Well, first, I'm not sure what he means and totally what he means here, Christopher. But what I'd say is, first, I think it's important that we travel and stay connected with the world. One of the less talked about casualties of COVID was the loss of global connectivity, the loss of global perspective. The first time I said this on stage was at COP26 in Scotland, and it was in November of 2021. And I said, look, before the pandemic, United Airlines carried 1,000 U.S. citizens a day to China and 1,000 Chinese citizens to the United States. And all that creates bridges and understanding that when things happen and there's a crisis, there's a lot of these bridges and perspective to understand. It doesn't mean we'll always agree, but we're a lot closer because we spend time together and understand each other. We carried 100 or so people a day back and forth each day to Russia. And what I said at the time was the world is a more dangerous place because we haven't been connected and people have become isolated and lost touch with others' perspective. That sadly turned out to be prophetic. So I think the first point is travel is important. It's not just something that people like to do. It's not just important for business. It is important for a global society. Juan Tripp said, something early in his career that his job was shrinking the world when he, at Pan Am, and that is true today. So what we should do, though, we need to continue to travel. We need to do it sustainably. And if you ask for, disruptive technologies to do that, I think the most disruptive thing doesn't just apply to aviation. It applies to the globe, and that is carbon sequestration. Like the only answer that we have to get the globe to zero that anyone has today. There's some theoretical silver bullets like fusion energy, but that's probably not happening anytime soon. But is carbon sequestration. That's just a matter of cost. We can sequester as much carbon as we want. I personally am an advocate for a price on carbon, for a carbon tax, because if we did that, it would drive the incentives correctly for carbon sequestration. But if you're looking for a disruptive technology, it's not unique to aviation, but it is carbon sequestration. At United, we were proud to be partnered with Occidental and 1.5 in what is the world's largest and first commercial scale carbon sequestration plant. Others are starting to do it now. When we started on carbon sequestration, I had to explain what that word meant to people. Many more people know it today. But if you're looking for a disruptive technology that can work, carbon sequestration is probably your answer.
Now, very quickly, because we're just about out of time, but I wanted to ask you briefly about your plans for electric aircraft. I think you're planning on fielding them or at least getting them in the air by the end of this decade. What sort of role do you envision for them, and how much of a difference could they make?
Yeah, electric aircraft and electric air taxis are both going to be great for short haul aviation. I mean, I think the easiest use case is, if you're in Midtown and want to get out to an airport, get out to the airport in Newark instead of sitting in traffic. You can take an electric air taxi, be quieter, safer than a traditional helicopter would have been. That's one of the use cases. The other one is short haul airplanes. Flying from Denver to Breckenridge or Denver to Vail. Those kinds of mountain communities. But that's really a kind of a niche. The reality is that the energy density for batteries is way too low for us to ever be able to fly big airplanes long distances. So electric aircraft are going to be, I think, important for short haul service, but they're not going to be big airplanes flying even medium haul distances. There's not even any theoretical technology on the drawing boards that would allow that. So it's important, but it's going to be focused on the short haul.
Fair enough. That does exhaust our time. I want to thank you, Scott Kirby of United Airlines, for joining us today. We appreciate having you with us. And thanks to all of you for joining the conversation. To see what else we have planned, please go over to WashingtonPostLive.com. I'm David J. Lynch, Global Economics Correspondent here at the Post. Thanks again for watching.